How can we use the principles of neuroplasticity to help us affect health and lifestyle changes that can help us live better and age better? I'm super excited to have with me here today, Sheena Murphy. Sheena is going to help us answer that question based on her vast experience as, get this, an Anat Baniel method neuromovement practitioner, a Wildfit coach, a certified hollow body coach, a life book leader, and a meditation and mindfulness teacher. Hi, I'm Anna Maria Pardo here at Move and Bloom, a safe space where together we can grow possibilities. And I can't wait to dig into this material with Sheena to find out how we can tune into our body, its unique needs, so that we can give it what it needs so that we can flourish. Without further ado, welcome, Sheena. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've been waiting to have this conversation with you for such a long time. Tell us, how did you get to where you are now? What's your story?
Yeah, so it's been a journey.
Yeah.
The last few years. So I guess it started back a couple years ago. My son is 6 now. And my son, everything was going the way we expected, right? You know, we had a good pregnancy, with birth. There was no real issues in the beginning. And then as my son started to grow, we started to realize that he wasn't meeting milestones and we were having different issues creeping up. And, we kind of fell into that story where, medically and developmentally, he wasn't progressing. It's emotional.
Our lives are not insta-feeds. This is a very emotional journey, and more power to you for being able to talk about it and share your heart openly with people. Thank you for doing that.
The journey started with my son. My son was born 6 years ago, and everything was what we expected. It was a good pregnancy. He was born with no real health concerns. However, looking back now, there was a lot of red flags that I didn't identify as a new parent, right? And as he started to grow and develop, he wasn't meeting milestones, and there was more and more issues starting to creep up over time. And it just kind of started to snowball. And we ended up in hospital for long periods of time and a whole bunch of testing. And it came back that my son has a mitochondrial disorder. So for your viewers, in case people don't understand what that means, is the mitochondria are basically the energy factories of every cell. Yeah. So, your liver needs to detoxify, your heart needs to beat, your brain needs to think and function and process, right? Well, it needs energy to do all of that. And it's the mitochondria that give the energy to the cells for that muscle or that organ. Our organs are essentially muscles to function. Well, my son's mitochondria aren't functioning properly. So it means that basically every system in his body is affected. And so we have different issues with digestion and, he's got liver issues, and we've had issues with the heart. And, obviously the brain hasn't developed and doesn't function the same as a typical child. Mm-hmm. So it's been a journey for me to try and figure out how to best support his body, but support his mitochondria is really kind of where my focus came from. Because if I can get the mitochondria functioning better, then maybe his body, his brain, his whole system will function better, is kind of the underlying premise that I took with all of this.
Yeah.
But it's also a matter of how can I provide stimulus to sort of evoke those missing pieces for him. And so that's what started this whole journey and really what led me into ABM, because I was that typical family who was running to, all the traditional doctors and therapists. I felt like I was running every day to somebody, multiple appointments a day for over a year, and we weren't going anywhere. And it was kind of that thing where it kind of felt like I was kind of hitting my head against the wall all the time. Like, it's putting all this money out, I'm putting all this time and investment, and I'm not getting any gains. And at a certain point, I had to kind of say to myself, like, what's the point? If I'm going to invest in something, I might as well invest in something that's going to give a return, right? And so one of the things that a therapist had once said to me is, we know your son doesn't have cerebral palsy. There's no brain damage. There is brain abnormalities, but there was never damage. And so, but they said, your son displays like a cerebral palsy patient in the way he carries himself, the way he moves. And so that was kind of my trigger term of like, okay, I'm going to search out different therapies for cerebral palsy. Yeah. And I came across Kids Beyond Limits by Anat Baniel and started to read that book. And I don't think I even got through the first chapter. And I was like, I need to find somebody to do this for me. And at that time, there was nobody in my local area that really was an ABM practitioner. However, I was able to connect with a Feldenkrais practitioner who started working with my son. And we worked for a couple of months, but she recommended me to go see Marcy Lindheimer, which is Anat's basically right-hand person. So I started traveling to New York to see Marcy. And it was crazy. So the first time we saw Marcy, it was amazing. We saw so many gains, like just small little changes in him, in his sort of like awareness of his body and parts of his body that he hadn't been aware of before. And we came home from that first intensive with Marcy, and my son absolutely had no core control. He had no ability to manage his core, or at this point he was 1.5 years old, and we couldn't even sit him. If you sat him in a chair or a couch, he would still flop to the side. So even positionally, he wouldn't be able to manage himself. And it was the first time that I had him kind of sitting against me. And my husband at that time came into the room. He had just come home from work because I had taken Logan to see Marcy on my own. And Logan actually kind of sat forward and could actually hold himself for a few seconds. And that solidified ABM for us. Exactly. It was like this aha moment for us that we had just found something that was like going to have an impact and going to move us forward. And so we continued to go see Marcy every couple of months for a period of time. And during that time, we were also meeting with doctors, and we had just got the mitochondrial diagnosis. And I realized at that point that this wasn't going to be like, okay, we do 5 or 10 intensives and we're cured, right? This is going to be a long journey with Logan, and he's going to need lots of input from ABM, probably for the rest of his life, as many of us do, right? Like, we don't realize that we all really need to be doing this work every day for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so I decided at that point to become the ABM practitioner so that I could incorporate this work into his daily life and really help to motivate or push him forward. And so that's how I got into ABM. Mm-hmm. And honestly, like, this kid is defying all his diagnoses, right? He's that typical kid now where they're like, well, I think we've misdiagnosed him. And because he's doing things that the doctors didn't ever believe that were possible, right? And so during all of this too, we had multiple hospitalizations, and Logan had been given a feeding tube. And that was the first time that Logan was ever put onto a formula. I'd been really adamant in his young life that I was going to get him breast milk. He wasn't able to feed from the breast. That's one of those sort of like red flag signs that now looking back, realized the mitochondria was playing into that. But I pumped my milk for the first year of his life. So he got breast milk, and then I made all of his food for when we started him on purees. But during that first year to year and a half, we started to run into major feeding issues with Logan as we were trying to implement the solid foods. And what we found out was that he had what they call a vascular ring. So developmentally, his heart formed backwards, and all of the ligaments that should have been on the outside of the body were on the inside. And as those ligaments formed, they wrapped around the trachea and the esophagus. And so they created exactly, a very small hole that as the trachea and esophagus grew, they were getting smaller and smaller. And so there was a constriction, which was leading to these feeding issues that we were having. So when we finally found this, they basically deemed him unsafe to feed because he was aspirating on all solids and liquids. Yeah. And then they put a tube in and put him onto formula. Mm-hmm. Well, that then started a whole other array of issues. We started to have major GI issues with reflux and different types of stooling, kind of oscillating between, having constipation and then just very liquidy. And there was a lot of GI stuff going on. That's when his seizures started. We had major feeding issues that put him into the hospital multiple times because he literally could not keep the food down. You would give him a feed and 10 minutes later, he would be vomiting back up. And so throughout these hospitalizations, they kept switching the formulas. Well, let's try this new hypoallergenic formula and all of this, and nothing worked for him, right? And so finally I had said to the doctors, I'm like, I've heard of this blenderized diet. I'm like, can we just try it? And they're like, well, we don't typically do that. And I ended up finding out that my son, we did this in 2017. So in 2017, my son was the first child in our local children's hospital to be put on a blenderized diet while hospitalized, which to me just kind of blew my mind. Real food, can we not figure out a way to give kids real food?
I love that idea.
So honestly, it was instantaneous turnaround. Wow. We went into the hospital, not able to keep any food down. The very first blenderized meal we gave him stayed down. Then the second, then the third. And that was my second really big aha moment with Logan is okay, we need, and we've all heard, the power of food or food is medicine and all of this sort of stuff, but it just slapped me in the face sort of thing with him. Yeah. And so that sent me on a journey with a variety of naturopaths and functional medicine doctors, really diving into a bunch of testing to look at food sensitivities and look at deficiencies in his body and a whole array of different things. And then starting to, over time, kind of tweak this blenderized diet. Yeah. And I started looking into dairy-free and gluten-free and all of these sort of inflammatory foods that we know are inflammatory, but we don't really understand what they do in our systems. And one of the things that I've really noticed with Logan and some of these other children that I work with is they don't have the same resilience factor, the ability to compensate. Their bodies are already dealing with so much that when you put something inflammatory into their systems, it kind of is this big red flag, big flashing light. This is not working. And that's what I see with Logan a lot is that, we give him a medication or we give him something synthetic and we have all the side effects and none of the control. Right. And it's because his body just can't compensate.
I'm so glad you brought this up because I hope there are special needs parents listening in, but there might be someone here looking to age well, or someone like me who has migraines, and all of us, just like Logan, have a lower threshold for some of these things. We don't have the resilience built in for whatever reason, whether it's our age, underlying conditions. And when you have that lower threshold, you really do have to take the time to figure out what sets you off. And exactly. I don't know if this happened to you or not, but a lot of people tend to think that it's going to be immediate, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just like removing pollution from a polluted body of water, right? The effects aren't immediate, but you have to keep doing the thing. You have to keep doing the thing to bring the threshold down. So I love it that you brought that up and that it has worked so well from Logan. Wow.
And kind of, I guess, to speak into that a little bit, Logan, I identified, has seizures, right? And it all started when we introduced formulas. Through my work with functional medicine and naturopaths, and we ended up putting him on the ketogenic diet for epilepsy, which did have powerful impacts, but it didn't control his seizures. I continued to work. And one of the things that I found when I got into Wildfit is Wildfit is really about going back to the true human diet. What did our body evolve to need in order to function? So what do we need to feed our system in order to fuel it for optimal brain function, optimal like speed, optimal resilience and immune system? Mm-hmm. And so functional medicine and naturopath were amazing. They made amazing changes, really started to open my mind. But they still work within the system of, let's see how we can still incorporate some dairy and some gluten and some of these foods that are more non-functional foods to make it easier for people to accommodate this sort of lifestyle, right? Which is okay for a lot of people. Yeah. But when you're dealing with somebody like Logan, whose system is so sensitive, you almost need to go to that next level. And that's what I found with him, is when we put him onto the ketogenic diet, we took out gluten. We had already taken out glutens and dairies and sugars, and like he was already eating very clean, but we were still giving him something like ghee, for example, which is a very purified version of butter, but it's still dairy. When I finally took out ghee and completely took out dairy because of Wildfit, the seizures decreased again. So it really talks to honing in your diet, honing in those sort of toxicities or inflammatory things in your system specific to you as an individual in order to move to those next levels that you need for healing. And that's what I have really found with Logan. And Wildfit is kind of taking that to the next level for his healing, but then my healing as well, right? Like that's part of the story, is my journey with Wildfit too.
What have you noticed in your own body? Because I assume you all eat the same stuff for convenience's sake.
Exactly. Well, yes and no. We eat a lot of the same stuff, but because of his blenderized diet and his specific keto ratio, there is a bit of a difference. But so when Logan was about, I guess, 3.5, my husband left at that point. And so I kind of ended up being the single mom with this medically complex child. And I was struggling, like really struggling with myself. I was about 50 pounds heavier than I am right now. I was like in pain. I'd get up, I'd have absolutely no energy hauling myself out of bed. And I'd start to walk and like my joints were sore and, I had headaches and like brain fog and just like, and I kind of had to do a bit of a reality check because I was like, I guess I was about 36, 37 at that time. Yeah. I have a 3.5-year-old and I'm struggling to manage him right now. And this isn't a kid that, is going to turn 18 and walk out my door and be self-sufficient. Like this is a lifelong caregiving process for me. And how am I going to manage in 5, 10, 15 more years? Am I going to be here in 5, 10, 15 more years for him because of the amount of stress and complexities that this lifestyle brings, right? Yeah. And so I really kind of said to myself, I need to focus on myself here and get my health back in check so that I can show up and be the parent that my child actually needs me to be now. And that's really where I'd heard about Wildfit multiple times. And I kind of was like, I need to do this program. I did it for me, but I ended up really being able to hone the information to help Logan as well.
Perfect.
And so I did that 90-day program. And honestly, I am healthier now, I think, than I've ever been in my life. Wow. Like my energy, my stamina, I'm not in pain anymore. I have, I have tumors in my left leg that have been kind of continuously growing throughout the years. They don't really know why they're there. They're benign tumors, but they have kind of infiltrated into muscles and bones. And so there's been a lot of different treatments over the years for myself. And so I had a lot of inflammation and pain with that leg. ABM got me out of a brace and got me back into walking more normally. But Wildfit took away the pain from all of this because I was starting to heal my body. Yeah. And I mean, it's not it's a journey. Wildfit is really about creating a lifestyle. It's not about being a diet program. Diet means sort of like a short term, right? I eat a specific way for a period of time, and then I go back to my old methods, is typically what happens with diets, right? Where with this, we want to actually create a sustainable lifestyle. And so this has really been about a healing journey for my body over time. And
your body and your brain.
And my brain.
And your brain,
Yes.
because we're moving into Alzheimer's Awareness Month, and some of the most promising protocols out there to help with dementia include diets that look remarkably like Wildfit.
It's true, right? Sugar isn't bad. Our systems evolved to have a mechanism to deal with sugar. The problem with sugar is the quantity and frequency that sugar is in our diets. And a lot of us don't even realize how much sugar is in our diets, right? Like there's a lot of hidden sugars in our food. And the reason for that is because the food industry realizes what sugar communicates to our body, right? There's two very core messages that when we eat sugar actually happens on a biochemical level in our bodies. One, it tells us to eat more. So, those people that are like, oh, I can't eat enough sugar. Like I have a little bit, and then it's like, I need to go back and have more, because when we eat sugar, it actually tells our body to keep eating. And this is a survival mechanism in our bodies. So if we go back into our evolutionary history, right, and our ancestors, the hunter and gatherers living out in the fields of Africa, right, which is where essentially Wildfit is stemming from. The founder of Wildfit has spent many years traveling with the Hadza for months, weeks and months at a time, really sort of living that hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So in addition to all of the research and data that he's done, he's actually lived this experience and really sort of started to formulate the Wildfit program from that true core human diet. And so the hunter and gatherers living out in the fields of Africa wouldn't have had sugar readily available to them, right? Like if you think about our seasons, we would have just gone through winter where food was scarce. Like there's no greens, there's no fruit, there's no animals, and then we move into spring. Again, look at our environment, right? The greens are starting to come abundant. Animal life is starting to come back, but there's no fruits out there. There's no sugars. Then we start to move into the summer season where berries come into play, right? But berries are very high in antioxidants, but they're actually lower sugar glycemic index. And then you move into fall, which is more of the season of abundance, right? Where you have that harvest season where the fruits and the vegetables and all of that are available. But again, you would have been out in these fields where, it's not like you would have had lines of berries and squashes and so you would have had to walk around and try and find this stuff. So if people came across a berry bush, they would have eaten as much as they possibly could have. And they would have tried to eat the whole bush in that one sitting. And if they couldn't, their body would then say, well, eat more, because the body wanted to take in as much sugar as possible in that time period, because you may not have that again. And then the second core message with sugars is to store weight. Because again, if you look at the seasonality of the growing season, the fall, where the majority of the sugars are available, is right before winter, where scarcity comes into play again, right? And so our bodies need us to store weight, just like, the chipmunks and the squirrels are storing acorns and the bears are storing fat for hibernation. Our bodies are telling us to store weight as well, so that we can live through the season of winter and survive. And so those biochemical messengers are there to protect us. The problem is there's a gap now between our biology and the advances that we've had in food technology, food science, and the abundance that we have, right, in our environment.
Yeah, we just have rows and rows of berries and no winter.
And that's our problem, right? Is people never put themselves into those other metabolic states where the body goes through the detoxification processes and the cleansing, the healing processes. Those other seasons where the sugar isn't available are super healing to our body.
Yeah.
And so, yes, sugar, again, there's a time and a place. They say that we would have eaten back in that hunter-gatherer period about 22 teaspoons of sugar in a year if we were lucky. We are now eating about 150 pounds a year.
Yeah.
Like that's a whole human versus this tiny little quantity of sugar.
That's crazy. And so you're living this lifestyle. Do you feel the cognitive or what kind of brain effects do you feel following this lifestyle?
Yeah. So one of the big things in the first part of Wildfit is really tapping into your psychology around food, right? Because a lot of us have been conditioned, we have different food rules. Like, I'm not super religious, but, you think back to the Bible and the stories about, Jesus's birth around Christmas. And what did they give? They gave myrrh, frankincense, right? They didn't give you chocolates and candy canes and all of these like dishes that we've been conditioned to think are associated to Christmas.
Right.
Or you think about, Easter, it wasn't about Easter bunnies and chocolates and all of that stuff, right? These are things that have been implemented and food rules and food conditioning that has happened over a period of time that now many of us actually link up certain events, certain holidays to needing certain types of food. And it could even be just something as simple as like, well, Friday's Pizza Fridays, or it's Pancake Sundays in my house, right? Like we have this whole like psychology and this emotional connection to food that is very powerful. And that's something that I've noticed even with myself on this lifestyle journey with Wildfit is it takes dedication, it takes time, and it takes different iterations of doing this to really go into all of your associations with these foods. And so if I'm in like a spring season where I'm being very clean eating and, really following sort of some of the guidelines, I have like amazing energy. Like I wake up in the morning and I'm just ready to go. And, I will wake up, 2 hours before my bedtime or before my wake time typically, and still have lots of energy. I don't have that 4 o'clock slump. I don't have any of the pain. I can sit and be super focused on a task for hours and not need that break. My ability to keep up with my son and get down on the floor and play with him and, up and down and all these different levels to do movements with ABM. I can do better TMLs, the transformational movement lessons, and experience more flexibility and movement in my body when I'm in that season.
Right. But so your trainings are dovetailing well here, because I heard you talking about our conditioned awareness around food, essentially. And really, that's exactly where Anat Baniel method works, in that field of habits and that field of possibilities, right?
Exactly.
So you can look at it from a Wildfit psychological perspective, or you could come in with some of the principles of neuroplasticity taught in Anat Baniel method, NeuroMovement, and approach it that way. Have you brought some of that into your approach with Wildfit?
So the programs are, ABM and Wildfit are very aligned actually in the way that they do that. Wildfit is structured to be very kind of slow, staggered progress over time, right? And really is about attuning to your body. One of the biggest things in Wildfit is talking to us about, the food timeline and some of this food dialogue that we have, which is really about going inward and understanding and connecting with ourselves to see, how food is affecting us. Just as in a TML or an functional movement lesson, you are tuning into your body to feel and know, where you can move within an ease, within gravity, and where there's restriction in your body or not restriction. It's about going inwards and really tapping into your inner knowledge, your inner knowing, right?
Nice.
And so I find that both programs are very similar in that correlation between neuroplasticity and how to bring about change in the body
Yeah.
for lasting change, right?
For lasting change. And I'm curious because in Anat Baniel method, it's iterative. You have to do it.
Mhm.
You mentioned you have to do it every day, but like we go for a training, then we take some time away and go back and maybe do similar stuff again. And it's sort of like a repetition, but it's more like an opportunity to keep growing, right?
Yes.
Like building on what happened before over and over and over again.
Because what happens is when you are building these new neural connections, right, they're very fine and fragile.
Yeah.
And you need to come back to them in order to start to thicken those neural pathways. And as you begin to thicken those neural pathways, you begin to override old habits. And these new habits become the forefront of your habitual patterns, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly from ABM or from Wildfit. It's exactly what we're trying to do is all these different iterations, one, help to reinforce these new habits, but also help to create distinctions. We talk about distinctions all the time in ABM, and it's the same thing in Wildfit. When I'm in that spring season, I feel specifically one way. When I come out of that and start introducing sugars back into my diet, there are some very key responses that my body has that if I didn't have those experiences with sugar versus the clean eating, I would never understand these reactions that are happening in my body. I need to have those distinctions in order to learn and grow. Just as in ABM, we have to create those distinctions in our movements in order to learn and grow.
Yeah, you said something beautiful one time when we were talking about how it's all about increasing connection and awareness, which is essentially what you were talking about now, that going inward, you're connecting with yourself, and you become aware of what's happening in one season, what happens in another, so you can make those finer and finer distinctions. Yeah, I love that.
It's definitely, that's where our learning and our growth happens, right? Otherwise we become stagnant. But we have to move into that place because that's how the brain learns. It's by distinguishing thing one and thing two.
Right.
Without that distinction, there is no learning, right?
Right. And for those who are looking to age well, it's also about having lots of options, because one thing they're finding with people who have, let me rewind. So one thing they find with people who have dementia is that when they look at their brains, they're not necessarily any more affected than the people's brains who don't exhibit signs of dementia. And one of the hypotheses is that if you have more varied connections, sort of like more routes to get to the same place, if you lose some, you're okay. But if you lose your one connection, your one route, you can't get where you need to go. That's why nouns fall away first in Alzheimer's, right? We usually have one thing, one name.
Exactly.
Right. So I love it that ABM and maybe Wildfit too helps you find ways to constantly be creating options for yourself.
Definitely. I find that with both. And it also, so in ABM, we talk about the variations with movement and sort of the physical ability too, but we also talk about like your emotional variance, right? And your psychological variance. And with Wildfit, what's really interesting is that you've got the physical part as well, which is the healing of the body, but you also heal the emotions and the psychological too, right? Like I said, the first part of the program is really about diving into some of your psyche and your connections, your conditioning around food. But what happens is as we start to heal the body, so when we store fat on our body, it's not just fat and water. It's also storing toxins and chemicals that are present in our system, right? To keep it away from our vital organs. Well, what happens is a lot of the times, many of us have these emotional situations, these crises, and we eat. We eat dysfunctionally to kind of help to calm whatever is happening in our bodies at that time, right? Well, when we are stressed and in a crisis like that, we're pumping cortisol and adrenaline and all of these stress hormones in our body. that increases toxicity in our body, acidity in our body, right?
Mhm.
And then we eat all of these foods that aren't
Mhm.
necessarily functional. So we're putting toxins and chemicals into our body, and then our body's storing fat. So our body actually stores like an emotional footprint in the fat. And what I find is as people go through this healing journey is many of them can have almost like a bit of an emotional roller coaster, because you actually then have to start processing these stored emotions as well that could be 10, 15, 20 years old, right?
Yeah.
And so as you're healing your body, you're also healing your emotions. You're also healing your psyche. And it's by doing that that also creates distinctions and learning to help create these variations, whether we're talking about variations from ABM or variations from Wildfit in your physical, emotional, and psychological context.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. They talk about that in the pain literature as well, because old habits die hard, and they literally give like a dying gasp because, you know, the body spent time and energy forming these pathways for us. It's not gonna, so there's usually like at the last minute, this reaction where you feel like, and you see it in kids, right? Like I saw it in my kids. I've talked to other ABM practitioners. Sometimes you don't know what is going on with them, but they are just so nuts. They're nuts. And then they wake up the next morning and they have a new word. Or with some kids, they take their first step. And it's because it does. Changing our behaviors means changing our body, right? We are one whole unit. So I'm really interested that that happens too as we change what we eat.
And what's interesting about that is that's actually a protective mechanism too, right?
Of course.
Our brains are resistant to change because our brain wants to keep us the same. Yeah. Because what happened yesterday and what happened today kept us alive. So I'm going to do the same thing because the odds are it's going to keep me alive tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that we consciously know some of these habits that we have in our life are not functional and are not really conducive to longevity or health.
Yeah.
So we have to override that brain's pattern in order to move past and allow for that change. But it takes a bit of sort of willpower and consciousness on our part in order to push the brain past its comfort zone.
Right. And it takes time, right? Is this a good place for you to talk about slow and how that might play out in Wildfit and ABM?
Well, we talk about slow in ABM all the time, right? About really slowing everything back down in order to be able to feel more, right? And to learn more through the process. If we go too fast, we automatically go into habit and then we turn off that learning capacity. There's a different part of our brain that actually is in the place when we go out of habits, right? When we're in habitual automation, our brain is working. But when we go and move out of habitual, we actually turn on different learning capacities in the brain.
Right.
And so that's what slow does, right?
Without triggering protective mechanisms.
Exactly. Yeah. And so by slowing down in the movements allows us to enter into that learning space, right?
Yeah.
The same thing with ABM, the program, or same thing with Wildfit, sorry.
Yeah.
The program is structured to slowly build on itself. So many people will, be given an elimination diet by a dietitian or a naturopath, and they're told you have to cut this out. And they maybe get like a week or two into it and they're like, I can't do this, right? Because it's too much. It's too much change at one time for the brain to process. And so the brain is automatically going to create situations and filters to put you back into that safe space.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Well, the way Wildfit is built is that it will build slowly. It's going to move somewhat similar to get you to an endpoint of, like, say, more of an elimination diet, but it's done strategically and done slowly over the course of weeks. So you don't feel that same sort of resistance or impact all at one time. And by the time we get to the middle of the program, people are like, I can't believe I'm eating the way that I am. And I've cut all this stuff out and it's easy. right? That's the most surprising thing that people say, is it was actually easy to do. And it's because it's slow transitions.
Yeah.
But even in saying that, when I'm coaching my clients in the living Wildfit perspective, so you start Wildfit by doing the 90-day challenge. But once you come out of the 90-day challenge, then you can move into what's known as living Wildfit. And it's really about how to make this even a more sustainable lifestyle, and how to continue that journey of learning and growing and healing and processing emotions and, the psychological connections and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
And when I'm coaching, some of the times my clients are like, I just can't get myself back into spring, or I'm struggling with this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, go back to the basics. We talk about all those different iterations in ABM and constantly going back and reinforcing patterns. It's the same way. Go back to your basics, focus on your hydration, focus on your breathing, and slowly add one more thing and just build yourself back up again.
And I bet you're a really great coach to have, because in the ABM training, we learn never to make anyone feel wrong, because they learn to move a certain way to make something work, right? It was just like the eating is an evolutionary advantage. Whatever habits we have served us well at some point. So why should we feel?
That's the thing. Our brain and our body is always trying to protect us.
Yes.
We may not like what's happening. We may not like that we're carrying an extra 50 pounds, but it's there because our body is trying to help us survive the next day.
Yeah.
What we need to do is learn how to tap into that inner knowing of the body, the inner wisdom of the body, and align ourselves, align the brain and the body. Mm-hmm. And that's something that is, again, very ABM-ish, right? In that it's all about the connection between the brain and the body. Wildfit is looking about that connection from the food perspective. But so many of us make our decisions up in our brain, and we forget about that connection to the body.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because it's so I haven't done Wildfit, but I am going through yet another iteration of tweaking my diet for migraines.
Yes.
And one of the things that has really helped me from the ABM perspective is that awareness of what I'm feeling in the present moment. Because even though it doesn't give me a headache, sometimes I can identify a trigger food because it'll give me neck pain temporarily, but I'll feel like, or I'll have, jaw pain. And the conventional wisdom is, oh, you were sitting at your computer. Oh, you were doing this, that, or the other. And I'm like, well, but I sit at my computer a lot of other times and don't get that. So why now? So this ability to tune in and really own what we feel without being like, just like with Logan, right? Like, why isn't this hypoallergenic formula working? Because it's not working. It's just not working.
It's so true. And it's funny because I really struggled with headaches and migraines. And I loved pizza. Pizza for me was like, I know. It's horrible, right? But pizza for me had a lot of associations, right? It was a celebratory food. Yeah. I had pizza Fridays in my house. So there was a lot of like love and connection around pizza. Pizza was, so I talked a little bit about my leg. I went through chemo when I was in high school. And when I was going through chemo, every time I would finish a treatment, my dad and I would go get pizza because that was my last meal for the next couple of days because I'd be so sick, I wouldn't be able to eat. So there actually became like a survival connection with pizza for me that I realized through my journey with Wildfit, right? So that has been a food that has really been an emotional journey, an emotional healing for me on many levels, right? But what I realized through my first iterations of Wildfit and really kind of tapping into the inner knowing and the feeling is exactly what you're talking about. There are certain types of mozzarella cheese that for me, if I eat it, like 10 minutes later, I start getting that neck pain. And then it comes into the jaw. And then an hour later, I have a full-blown migraine.
Yeah.
And it's because of the type of cheese or the type of preservative. It seems to be certain mozzarellas, because I can eat some mozzarellas that don't have the same. So there's certain types of mozzarellas that do that to me.
Yeah.
I never correlated that. I used to have migraines all the time, up until the last couple of years when I started with Wildfit. And we always thought that there was a mold issue. I remember in school, I would always get a migraine on Mondays. The classroom's been closed up for the weekend. Everybody was thinking there was a mold issue in the classroom. It didn't correlate to me that it was because I ate pizza on Friday night.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem too, right? Is if we're eating a lot of these non-functional foods, at a certain point, our bodies stop sending us messages of the dysfunction or the problems that they're causing, because the body is literally trying to clean up the mess from what you just ate.
Mm-hmm.
And so the connection between the time that we eat the food and the resulting symptom can actually be very delayed.
Yeah.
And that's something that too, with Wildfit, as you start to heal your body becomes a lot more honest and a lot quicker in responding. So you can make those connections a lot easier.
Yeah. And we're better listeners too.
Yeah, we do become better listeners.
So I know we've been on here for a while, but I want to ask you one more thing before I ask the final question, because I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there's conditioned awareness and that we will always have conditioned awareness, so that when we know that, we can actively choose how we condition ourselves. So could you talk about perhaps how, because we do it as practitioners, right? We get together, we talk together, we support each other. We did you see that? Yes, I saw that. How do you do that in your Wildfit communities?
Yeah, so we actually have, we can do one-on-one sessions, but I actually tend to like to have a small group so that we actually get together every week as a small group and talk about all of this stuff. Talk about our conditioning, talk about things we're struggling with, talk about our wins, because we really want to focus on the positive aspects that we're experiencing as well, right? But that group community helps to, one, support each other as you're going through the process, but also really helps to sort of highlight different things. So, you may bring up something that I hadn't thought about, or I was struggling, but didn't necessarily know how to talk about it or to put words to it. And so that group community really helps to kind of facilitate that discussion and expand on what we're learning, expand on different ideas of foods that we could incorporate into our diet or different recipes. You may talk about a win that you had that week. Like maybe, you woke up in the morning and you just had an abundance of energy, or you realized that, you had this like kind of pressure in your chest for a while that all of a sudden is gone. Well, by you talking about that, the person next to you who may have been struggling that week and maybe mentally focused on more of the negatives is like, oh, I don't have pressure in my chest anymore either. Right. And it kind of helps to also change the conversation for everybody too.
Yeah. And there's the subliminal aspect too, right? Because for survival's sake, we attune to each other and mimic each other's behaviors. I know when I saw you sipping from your water bottle, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm thirsty. and it's just, it's below our conscious processing. We need to surround ourselves with people who are going to help us strengthen those neural connections that we're working so hard to build.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to really support each other, right? Like there's periods through the program that are challenging. And when you have foods that you're having to heal a relationship from, like for me, pizza being a survival food, right? You need to have that safe, supportive place to offload to people who understand the journey that you're going through too. Because Wildfit, it's a beautiful community of people. We have this Wildfitters lifestyle, but it kind of doesn't always correlate with your family and friends. And they don't always necessarily, if they're not going through the program too, don't always necessarily understand why you're having these emotional roller coasters, or you're feeling grumpy one day, or, so you also have that sort of, I don't, barrier is not the right word, but sort of like disconnection at times between people around you in your immediate circle, that you can then go to your Wildfit community and be like, this is what I'm experiencing today. Like, I just need somebody to listen and understand me, right?
Beautiful. I love that. I love that. So do you have any groups or offerings right now that people can jump into?
So my next Wildfit class is going to start on Monday, June 13th. So if anybody wants to check that out, you can check out my contact information, reach out to me. And other than that, I'm doing ABM all the time. So if anybody's interested in finding out more about ABM, I am part of Evolve Movement up in Canada. So we have different offerings through there, different classes going on. We have practitioners. We just started a community for special needs parents. So that's also a really great opportunity, that there are people who are looking for a community from within the special needs world. Evolve is offering that now.
That's so wonderful. Oh my gosh. Yes. And those links to Sheena's, it's your Facebook page, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Sheena's Facebook page will be in the YouTube description, and Sheena can drop them in the comments when this goes live on Facebook and Instagram. But yeah, check it out, because I'm so excited about all the things I see happening, and that there's a community, right? We were just talking about community, that there's a community of practitioners who all bring a lot of different strengths to the table.
Yeah. And that's really what we're trying to do, is provide a more holistic, well-rounded approach for parents and, anybody really. Like the services that we offer, we're coming from sort of the lens of special needs parents, because that's who we are. But these services can have major healing capacity for anybody. And there's so much value for anybody. But I mean, I wish I'd had a community like this back years ago when I was struggling to figure out how to help Logan. Like, it's always better to have supports and have community around you, so that you're not trying to do it on your own.
Yes, we're not evolved to do that.
No, we are evolved to be social beings, and we need people around us.
Yeah. So for the people whom I see, which are usually people looking to age well, what parting gem do you have for them, and anyone else who might be listening?
I think the biggest thing, and this goes to both ABM, Wildfit, eating, everything in life, really, it talks to, is it's always about progress, not perfection. So many of us try to do everything perfectly, and then when it doesn't go right, we just kind of drop off the train, right? Yeah. Don't do that. Just focus on what you're doing right, how you're progressing. Maybe it's just 1% every little day. You're just making the smallest incremental changes. And that's really how you build lasting change, is small incremental changes, because those small incremental changes will build over time, and that changes the trajectory of your life. And that really talks about the flexible goals with ABM too, right? In that really just kind of showing up and being open to perceiving what's happening around you, perceiving what's happening inside you, and working within that, and just working towards making progress.
Beautiful. Thank you for joining me, and I can't wait for us to connect again. Be well.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everybody.